Guys, you are not gonna believe what is happening right now. That's right, after all of this time of being like, I swear someday I'm gonna get there, I am here with an official episode 7 of my American President's Reading Challenge. If you're like, wow, what are you talking about? Because I've been making supplemental episodes for like the last year, yeah, I don't blame you. Some of the presidents that I have tried to get into, they're really hard to find books on, particularly because my preferred method is audiobook. It's just much easier for me, particularly when I'm in school. So I'm riding the struggle bus, guys. We will go over at the end of this episode exactly who I have left, but I have five books, 5 presidential biographies of very middling quality to tell you guys about today. So who are we hitting today? We are hitting Martin Van Buren, Warren G. Harding, Herbert Hoover, Gerald Ford, and Donald Trump. And that is a really bonkers list of presidents, but that kind of just shows you where I am in the timeline. I'm all over the place, and I'm trying, guys. I'm trying to get there. At this point, I don't even remember what order I read these in, so we are going to go oldest president to newest. Needless to say, that means we'll be starting with Martin Van Buren and then ending with Donald Trump. So for Martin Van Buren, I actually read a book, believe it or not. I read this book in hard copy, and it is Martin Van Buren and the American Political System by Donald Cole. Let me just say straight away that unless you are someone like me doing a challenge like this, trying to read a biography on every single American president, you do not need to read this book. This book is from the 1980s, and it is an academic text. Neither of those things disqualify it. However, it is meaty, it is chunky, it is not written to be easily read necessarily. It is written like an academic text, and trying to wade through the pages, it feels like an academic text. Again, I am an academic, but like, yikes. I think one of the things that Cole is probably struggling with is that Martin Van Buren, he's not a very well-known president. Not a lot of things happen during his presidency, and he only serves one term. He is president right after Andrew Jackson. He is handpicked to succeed Andrew Jackson by Old Hickory himself. However, I mean, at that point in American history, there was no one who could measure up to the stature of Andrew Jackson. And Martin Van Buren is, he's smaller, he's dowdy. People call him the old fox, sly fox, white fox, because he's basically known as being a tricksy, political maneuverer. The reason that it is important to read about Martin Van Buren, though, if you're interested in the formation of our politics, is that during the time when Andrew Jackson is trying to get elected, it's Martin Van Buren for a lot behind the scenes in New York state politics, really forming the basis of what is our party system today. It really didn't come about, this popular party system, until Martin Van Buren made it, basically to elect Andrew Jackson. He starts small in New York state politics and builds up really his own political machine, one of the first instances of a major New York state political machine, and he is instrumental to the skeleton of our political system today. That's why this book is sometimes really hard to read. You have to want to enjoy the ins and outs of political maneuvering, machination, shenanigan, and not like, very exciting like policy debates or anything like that. Honestly, Van Buren's presidency is one of the least interesting parts of this book. I did have one kind of issue in how Cole wrote this book, which is that he makes a statement like, Martin Van Buren has been called a political flip-flopper, but he was not a political flip-flopper. He was a man who stood by his convictions, and then promptly shows like 10 pages of Martin Van Buren flip-flopping on issues. And then in the end, he's like, Martin Van Buren was a great patriot who really, really cared about his country and had a strong backbone. And then President Franklin Pierce is like, hey, Van Buren, can you set up a council right before the Civil War. Like, can you set up a council and get some leaders from both sides together? And Van Buren's like, nah. So it was just moments like that where I was like, am I missing something here? Am I not understanding this? I think in another instance, I would say this is a book where I want to read another Martin Van Buren biography to try to understand a little bit more. But this one was so dry. I have a really hard time thinking about going back to poor Martin Van Buren. So maybe someday I'll go to his home site. It's not that far away from me in New York. So, you know, maybe that will rev the juices again. But I'm just glad this one's in the bank. So moving far down the line to The Jazz Age President Defending Warren G. Harding by Ryan Walters. If you watched my best and worst books of 2022, then you know that this book was the worst book that I read in the year 2022. I did not enjoy this reading experience at all, and I will tell you why. So first of all, this book has a couple of things not working in its favor in terms of how I feel about it. First of all, it's under 200 pages. It is very, very small. I read it in hard copy and it literally just felt like a sliver. And I was like, this is not gonna have the level of detail in it that I want. Secondly, the subtitle, Defending Warren G. Harding. I'm not deeply a fan of books that are ideologically centered like that. However, I thought, okay, at least I know where he's coming from and I know the basics of why Warren G. Harding is considered one of our worst presidents by some people. And there was a lot of corruption. He cheated on his wife with a very young woman. There's like a whole bunch of stuff. And so, you know, there might be reasons why this author thinks that he's gotten a bad rap and we need to re-examine his presidency, because a lot of it is also colored by the fact that he never served a full term. He died in office and was succeeded by Calvin Coolidge. Yeah, no, this book is just, it has terrible sourcing. The citations, it looks like there's a lot of them, but really it sources from a very, very small number of texts. It drops in criticism and then doesn't address it. And for a book that is supposed to be defending Warren G. Harding, to mention, oh yeah, there was corruption, and then to really not deal with that at all. I mean, the whole Nan Britton affair thing, barely dealt with at all. And it really just seemed like in some of the bigger instances where maybe there wasn't that much defending to be had, the author just ignored them rather than handling them head on. There was some bizarre allusions to Warren G. Harding and Donald Trump, which didn't stick to me. It was just, it seemed like a very bizarre parallel to make. And also, one of the overwhelming feelings of this book is that the author really, really, really hated Woodrow Wilson. There is a lot of Woodrow Wilson hate in this book. And listen, Woodrow Wilson is not my favorite president either, but you're reading this really small book with very little like actual historical fact that is a lot of invective and polemic against Woodrow Wilson. And I'm like, I'm not even really sure what I'm learning here. So I was excited about this book because it is a new-ish release. And I was like, oh, that's really exciting. Maybe there's something about Warren G. Harding that we've discovered or uncovered or rethought in the last few years. No. Yeah, don't read that book. It's not worth your time. So moving on to a book I actually did enjoy, we have Hoover, An Extraordinary Life in Extraordinary Times by Kenneth White. And I was not sure how I felt going into this book. It is very chunky, the exact opposite of the Harding. It's very large, over 700 pages. And basically all I know about Hoover is that a lot of people like to blame him as the cause or a cause of the Depression, and he got voted out to vote FDR in. That is all American history class really tells you about Hoover. And what I loved about this book is that there are some presidential biographies that will kind of glide over their early life and then really focus on their time in the presidency. And White makes this really strong decision to focus on his childhood, but then to also focus on the amazing humanitarian work and business work that Hoover did prior to being elected to the presidency. And this is a part of his life that really, at the time, was extraordinary to people all across the globe. You know, he fed starving people during World War I, for example. And he was this major mover in the agriculture world here in America, and he did great work. He did have questionable business practices in his mining operation, which people can debate, but his life, even before he was elected president, was incredible. And because his presidency ended in such a bad way, people never hear about that part of his life. So honestly, I was really engaged in that section. And then when I actually got to the presidency, I was like, oh, now things are gonna go downhill. So I really appreciated that from this book. I do feel like I learned way more about Hoover than I definitely knew before. Even though this is an attempt at an objective biography, I do feel like White comes out on the side of needing to defend Hoover from history a little bit. Not, you know, treating him as like a god or anything, but I do feel like maybe someone with a different economic outlook or something may have different views on his presidency, his economic policies, his mining practices, all that kind of stuff. But in terms of an engaging, well-read book that taught me a lot, no complaints. I will maybe someday read another Hoover. There are some other really popular Hoover biographies out there. My friend Josh from Literary Gladiators has recommended at least a couple to me, so maybe someday, but I'm really happy with this choice. Moving right along to Gerald Ford, a much more recent president. We have When the Center Held, Gerald Ford and the Rescue of the American Presidency by Donald Rumsfeld. Now, Donald Rumsfeld is a giant political figure in his own right. He was chief of staff to Gerald Ford and eventually serves in the cabinet for George Bush. So he's got a lot of baggage attached to him. He has his own huge standing. And he wrote this book about his friend, Gerald Ford, essentially trying to refashion Ford's image. He does not have the best viewed presidency. Obviously, he was never elected to be either president or vice president. He was appointed vice president when Nixon's Vice President Spiro Agnew was forced to exit stage left due to some other criminal charges that are not as well known as Watergate. But then, of course, Watergate happens and his appointed vice president becomes the appointed president. And then, of course, he loses his own election bid to Jimmy Carter. I was definitely interested in this book because I read a lot about Richard Nixon, and I've read a lot about Ronald Reagan, and I've even read some on Jimmy Carter. And in all of these stories, if they're trying to do much connective tissue, they often just kind of whoop over Gerald Ford's presidency, because in the grand scheme of the narratives of those three men, it really is a blip. But obviously, this is a huge moment in Ford's life, and I was really interested to sit with that moment a little bit more and learn a little bit more about Ford the man, Ford the president. Despite having Ford's name in the title, this book should really be called Me, Donald Rumsfeld, and How I Advised the President, because that is really the overwhelming feeling of this book. Donald Rumsfeld, I mean, to be fair, mostly talks about situations that he was involved in, which is fine, but it's very much like, here is how I advise the president. And of course, Rumsfeld tends to make the right decisions, and when he's not listened to, they're the wrong decisions. And yeah, it's quite short, and there is a distinct lack of emotion in the book until the end, when Rumsfeld essentially gives like a eulogy of Ford. And so the ending of it is really emotion packed and really lovely about Ford the man, Ford the person, and what Ford was trying to do in this moment and how difficult it was for him. But the fact that that all comes really in like the ending, it felt really uneven and really frustrating. And yeah, it just was a little bit of false advertising with that title. So moving on to my Donald Trump book. Now, I questioned whether or not to add this particular title to my list of official biographies. So just now in the year 2022-23 are the definitive biographies of Carter and Reagan coming out. Now, Carter makes some sense because he's still alive as of this taping. But the reason that we're only just getting some definitive looks or relooks at their presidencies is because, there's a delay in history, right? We really can't know the historical ramifications of some things until time has passed and we see how economic, political procedures, rules, law, like whatever, have an effect on our society, right? So everything past Reagan, essentially, I have questions on how good those biographies can be in general, especially if the person is still alive. And obviously, Donald Trump is one of our most recent presidents. And I did question this, but I'll tell you why I decided to include it. So I'm including The Divider, Trump in the White House 2017 to 2022 by Peter Baker and Susan Glasser. And I'm including it for the fact that, I've been reading a lot of political science lately. I've been reading a lot of books filled with strong feeling on both sides about the Trump presidency and its aftermath and all that kind of stuff. And when I read The Divider, I closed it and I went, wow, that was just a collection of events strung together in a narrative telling me what happened during the Trump presidency. It wasn't written with, high invective language on, to any high emotion. It was just a telling of Trump, how he came to be in the White House and what he did while he was in it, using past news coverage, but also hundreds of new interviews conducted for that book. And I was genuinely surprised by that because I don't think I've really come across a book that has tried to just tell the story of the events of what happened without being very pithy or passing a lot of judgment. And I'm not a Trump fan. I'm not. But having that reaction to this book, I was like, wow, I feel really confident adding that to my full biography list because this is probably the best I am going to do for this for some time. So even though obviously there's no grand historical sweeping discussion about, the after effect of his time in the White House, because while we are aware of the immediate effects, we have no idea how it will ripple out into history in the same way we can from presidents that came before. But I decided to include it because the book is exactly what it says it is. I enjoyed it in the way that it was easy to read. It was a very coherent narrative. It strung things together, and in some point I was like, oh my goodness, that's right. That happened right after that, and then this, and then that, in ways that maybe you forget if you are reading books that focus in on one or two events, like the impeachments, for example. So I have no great feelings about this book, but I have no issues with this book. That is what this book is trying to give to you. Here's what happened in 4 years, one after another. Here's how the dominoes stood up in a line. So I'm including that for this list to kind of also, to be fair, check that box, because I would someday like to be done with this challenge. And at this point, I have gained 2 presidents since I started it. So yeah, I'm losing ground, guys. So those are my reviews of my 5 presidents for today. I am halfway through a book on William Henry Harrison. He's one of my presidents that I have left, but I've also been halfway through that book for 6 months. PhD is a struggle, guys. I also still need to read a book, so William Henry Harrison, Zachary Taylor, Franklin Pierce, James Buchanan, Benjamin Harrison, William Clinton, and Barack Obama. 7. I have 7 left. I am so close. I can taste it. And yet, let me tell you guys, like people like William Henry Harrison, who wasn't even in the presidency for 100 days, there's not a lot to read about this man. Zachary Taylor, same thing, also died in office and no one really cares. Franklin Pierce, no one really cares. James Buchanan, no one really likes him. Benjamin Harrison, oh, he's the guy who was there for 4 years in between 2 Grover Clevelands. And then I have issues with the Clinton and Obama books. Again, kind of like with most of the recent presidents, they're just not, I don't like them, and I don't like the lack of historical view. But eventually I'll get there. Eventually I'll get that done. And that's where I am in this challenge right now. So I'm really excited to have another one of these episodes done. If you have any recommendations for those presidents that I still have left, let me know. If I have to read it in print, I will. If it's an audiobook, so much the better. Thanks, guys. Bye.